All right, Mark Ashley.
Can everyone hear me? If you can nod, good, thank you. Rabbi, I wish we had recorded your kind and warm words about me. That it would have been nice to have had those for posterity. But thank you for those words, Rabbi, and welcome everyone. I'm glad to see so many friends and family. All sorts of family members are on as well. So thank you everyone for getting up early on Sunday morning. And I do have to say, it's for those of you who were in shul at Or Zarua yesterday, I feel privileged to give a talk after that really wonderful Shabbat we had together, the Shabbat service, the Kiddush in Anthony Banfield's honor, that really brought our community together. And I felt a sense of wonder and majesty in the community that we created together. And that's some of what we'll talk about today. I'm going to just give a very brief introduction, and then we're going to I'll share my document with you. I think I'm going to talk through the entirety of my sources and then open it up for any questions at the end. So if you have any questions along the way, please keep them in mind till we finish the text. So as the title of my lecture is The Last of the Miracles Did God Retire After Hanukkah? What I'd like to talk about is whether, in fact, we now live in a miracle-free time. Has God retired from the business of making miracles for us as a Jewish people? So the focus is really on miracles that are national in scope and scale and relevance, as opposed to the possibility of individual miracles that are not necessarily advertised or known by the community of Jews, but rather miracles that were done for the Jewish people as a whole. If in fact we are living in a miracle-free time and God has left the scene of miracle making, what does that mean for history and for us? And I think what I'm going to try to show is that Hanukkah can be used as a prism and a pivot point, a critical juncture in Jewish history to understand our relationship with God and our reality and ourselves. So just a reminder, the events of Hanukkah took place during the 2nd century before the Common Era, so in the 160s BCE, so before the time of Jesus. That was a long time ago. And the suggestion I'm making is that there really have been no obvious national miracles since more than 2,000 years ago. It's, I think at minimum, assuming one believes in God, and I'm not going to argue about whether there are or are not miracles. This is really sort of an intellectual history, an outline of Jewish thinking about miracles, and I'm only going to do it in an hour. So we have limited time, and there's a lot more that can be said on many of these subtopics. But I think at minimum, one can say that God's presence in our lives is no longer conspicuous. It's not self-evident. It's not obvious. And that represents both a challenge and, I will suggest, also an opportunity for us. So what I'd like to try to answer, at least in part, in this lecture is, how does Hanukkah shed light, and I intend that pun, on our experience as a Jewish people in light of what Hanukkah teaches us about the miracles that occurred during the events of Hanukkah and the aftermath of Hanukkah that seems absent of such miracles. All right, so now I hope I'll successfully share my. Rabbi, I thought I was host, but it looks like you've disabled me. How do I claim that? Okay. Can everyone see my document now? Okay, so there's the title. By the way, I should have said at the beginning, Chodesh Tov, it is the second day of the new month of Tevet, and Chanukah Sameach to everyone. We're going to light the eighth candle tonight. And so today is the seventh day, and we only have one day left of the holiday, but this is an opportune time to talk about the significance of the holiday. I want to start off with just some basics about the Hanukkah miracle, the one that the miracle that we're most familiar with, the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days rather than just one. And we'll talk about what are the miracles of Hanukkah. But I wanted to start off with a text from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, his great code of Jewish law. These are the laws of Purim and Hanukkah that he combined in a single package. And he writes, the commandment of lighting the Hanukkah menorah is exceedingly precious. He says it's a mitzvah chaviva hi ad me'od, which is unusual language, that he's saying this is really a special mitzvah, special commandment, and one should carefully observe it in order to acclaim the miracle. Kedei lahodia hanes. So that references this theme of pirsuman denisa, that the publication, the publicization of the miracle that the rabbis say is our mandate during the holiday, and that's why we light the Chanukah in the window these days, or in the doorway. So one should carefully observe it in order to acclaim the miracle, ever praising and thanking God for the miracles that God has performed for us. Even if, and this is striking, even if one has nothing to eat except what he gets from charity, he should borrow or sell his garment in order to buy oil and lamps and light them. The rabbi spoke about, I think it was Friday night, Rabbi, he spoke about the resources that we have to dedicate to lighting the Chanukah. It's not inexpensive and it wasn't inexpensive for Jews in prior generations to have the money to have both the Chanukah and the oil and the wicks that went along with fulfilling this mitzvah. But the Rambam, Maimonides, is telling us we really need to do everything we can to light the candles in order to fulfill the mandate of acclaiming, of publicizing the miracle. That's the point, really, of lighting the candles, that the miracle of the oil needs to be published and advertised to the world, not just for us, but for others as well. So the Rambam places a very high premium on this mitzvah. This next text, number 2, is from Rav Yosef Karo, who is renowned as the author of the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century. This is actually from his prior work, the Beit Yosef, which was a prior code of Jewish law, or a commentary on a prior code. Rav Yosef Karo wrote, one could ask, and I suggest that many of us probably have never thought about this, and it's a very good question. One could ask why they established, meaning why the rabbis established an 8-day celebration at all. After all, since there was enough oil in the sealed jar to light for one night, then the miracle actually was for 7 nights. So his point was that the oil was supposed to last for a night. It lasted for 8. So the surplus of the miracle was only 7. It's not accurate to say that the miracle was lasted for 8 days or nights. It was really only 7. So why do we have a holiday marking this miracle that is constituted of 8 days as opposed to 7? One could answer, and here he provides 3 answers, and one can infer that because he doesn't provide one definitive answer, he was not satisfied with any of them in particular. One could answer that they divided the oil they found into 8 parts and placed one portion in the menorah each night, which nonetheless burned until morning. Thus, the miracle occurred every night. So that's one way you can spin it, that the miracle actually lasted 8 nights. Further, you could say, so here's a second suggestion. Further, you could say that after they filled the menorah on the first night, the jar remained full of oil as it was in the beginning, and thus the miracle was recognizable even on the first night. So even on the first night, the miracle was starting to occur. Alternatively, they poured all the oil into the menorah on the first night, and though the candles burned all night, they found them still full of oil in the morning, and so it happened each night. I brought this text because I think it's a good question. And many of us, I think, probably just pass over the fact that the miracle, the miraculous nature of the oil miracle lasted 7 days as opposed to 8. And by the way, a modern rabbi a few decades ago collected 100 different answers to this question. So it's Rav Yosef Karo asked a provocative question. It's elicited many responses, none of which is definitive because so many have been offered. Okay, now we're going to move into the after we've now learned that the mitzvah of lighting candles is exceedingly precious according to Maimonides, and that just establishing that the miracle actually lasted 7 days as opposed to 8. This gets us into the meat of the issue that I want to address. Hanukkah represents a watershed in Jewish history because what transpired before it was very different. When we look at the Torah, and I brought text 3 here is from Exodus. I could have brought many different texts from the Torah. This is a proxy for dozens of texts that we could have looked at. But the Torah is replete with miracles. And we all know this. I mean, you could start with the creation of the world, but both for good and bad. The flood of Noah, that was a miracle too. It was a destructive miracle. And some miracles, by the way, are not necessarily redemptive. They could also be damaging. But what we have in mind usually when we speak of the Bible's miracles are those of the 10 plagues, the splitting of the Reed Sea of Yam Suf upon the Exodus from Egypt. So Exodus, the book of Exodus, is filled with God's miracles. And in fact, there's no precise term for miracle in the Torah. There are various words, otot, niflaot, moftim, various words, but they all have as their primary, as the gist of what they intend to convey, is that these are signs and messages of God's power. These are the miracles that we read about in the Bible, particularly in the book of Exodus, are those that display God's omnipotence, God's ability to do anything, whenever and wherever God decides to perform such miracles at God's unfettered discretion. So the miracles in the Torah are proof of God acting not just through history, but in history. God intervenes in history. God has providence over the world, and he cares about, in the Torah, about the Jewish people enough to intervene at important junctures of our history. So the Torah is filled with such evidence of God's acting in history. The divine presence in the book of Exodus, for example, is not a mere inference. God's action in history through miracles is all over the place. So in Exodus 14, this is the verse in the great parsha of Beshalach, right before the Song of the Sea, Az Yashir, and when Israel saw the wondrous power that the Lord had wielded against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. They had faith in the Lord and his servant Moses. Vayaminu b'Hashem u'Moshe Abdo. So this indicates that the byproduct of the people's witnessing the miracles was faith in God and in God's messenger, in Moses. So again, this is just an example. I could have brought many such texts, but in the Torah itself, and particularly in the book of Exodus, but not exclusively in Exodus, God's power is unconstrained and can be wielded at God's unfettered discretion. So that's sort of the biblical view of miracles. They happen a lot. They happen whenever God wants them to happen. God acts in and very, very sort of conspicuously in history on behalf of his chosen people. The next text I'm moving forward in time, but really this is conceptually built on the basis of the Bible's, the biblical generation's conception of miracles. This is an excerpt from Sefer HaKuzari of Yehuda Halevi, who lived in the 12th century in Spain, a famous poet philosopher. And Halevi really featured miracles and the miraculous nature of revelation as the basis of faith. He was not particularly a rationalist. And he said, look, the Torah tells us to believe in miracles. That is sufficient basis for us to believe in God. Here in this excerpt, he wrote, later on, when the Israelites came to the sterile desert, God sent them food, which, except on the Sabbath, was produced daily for them, and they ate it for 40 years. This is irrefutable. That is a thing which occurred to 600,000 people for 40 years. 6 days in the week, the manna came down, but on the Sabbath, it stopped. This makes the observance of the Sabbath obligatory, as divine power is connected with it. So for Halevi, historical experiences through miracles constitute unimpeachable evidence, unimpeachable testimony of God's relationship with us. And the fact that they were very public. The manna came down, 600,000 people witnessed the miracle. It wasn't a couple of sort of suspicious types who claimed that a miracle occurred to them. It occurred on a national basis to hundreds of thousands of people, and it didn't last for a day or two. It lasted for 40 years, this miracle of the provision of manna as food, as sustenance for the people on their journey through the desert. So these public national scale miracles are our certifiable validation and confirmation of faith. They are the opposite of sort of a fraudulent miracle because they occurred on such a public national scale. So those public national miracles confirm God's providence and affirm God's authority and the authenticity of the revelation that occurred in the desert. I didn't include this, but a text in the 3rd chapter of the book of Joshua is also on point here. Joshua says, Bezot teidun ki el chai b'kirbechem. A miracle occurred as they were crossing the Jordan River, and Joshua says, through this miracle, you will know. So the observation of a miracle creates the knowledge that can accompany faith in God. You will know that a living God is in your midst. So these miracles in the Bible were evidence that God cared, that God's presence was really sort of palpable, was tangible, was irrefutable in the life of the people. This next text is from a very interesting book. I've used it before in my adult education classes at Orzarul, One People, Two Worlds. It's Amiel Hirsch, who's a Reform rabbi. Yosef Ryman is an Orthodox rabbi. They're in dialogue with each other about important concepts and themes in Judaism. And this is Ryman, the Orthodox rabbi, writing. Mindful, the backdrop here, he's mindful that other religions also claim that miracles have occurred as supposed proof or confirmation of their truth, of their authenticity. And Ryman wants to go out of his way to say our miracles, the Jewish miracles, are better. He writes, wouldn't it have been convincing if Jesus had skimmed over every rooftop in Israel and Europe and blessed the people after he supposedly rose from the dead? But of course, no one would dare make such a claim. Instead, only a few people were privileged to see the empty tomb and tell the rest of the world about it. A low-risk story. Take it or leave it. Judaism, however, here he builds on the point that Halevi just made, the public national scale of the miracles in the Jewish Bible. Judaism, however, dares to claim revelation, and not just any revelation, but 40 consecutive years of spectacular miracles. This cannot be a lie. No one would have accepted it. So again, building on Halevi, and contrary to an argument in modern thought that we'll see in just a moment, Rabbi Ryman is arguing that some miracles are in fact superior to other supposed miracles. They are more believable, more persuasive. So this reflects that the traditional Jewish view that history is really a repository of God's miraculous presence in Jewish history, at least through the Bible. As we read the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, God's miraculous presence is repeated, it is palpable, it is irrefutable, and it is the basis of the people's faith. And by the way, it's better evidence than other religions can proffer on behalf of their own authenticity and credibility. The next text, though, I wanted to include because the Torah itself has some ambiguity and some skepticism about miracles. The bottom line is, miracles are not necessarily exclusive to the Jewish God or the Jewish prophets. Deuteronomy says, if there appears among you a prophet or a dream diviner, and he gives you a sign or a portent, saying, let us follow and worship another God, whom you have not experienced, the Torah comments. Even if the sign or portent that he named to you comes true, do not heed the words of that prophet or that dream diviner. For the Lord your God is testing you to see whether you really love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. So Deuteronomy, at least, in the Torah suggests that false prophets, but not prophets in the sense that they don't have the capacity to perform miracles or to predict the future. So they're actually real prophets to that degree, to that extent, that they can actually perhaps perform a miracle or predict the future for you. But if their message is not the appropriate message, then don't follow them, and it's really just a test from God. So this raises the problem of why God would allow false prophets to exist. But again, prophets who have the capacity to engage in miracle making or telling the future, but whose message can lead you astray. Why does God allow that? But putting that issue aside, what Deuteronomy is teaching us, and the rabbis reinforce this message, is that miracle making is not a dispositive sign of divinity or of divine message. That you have to focus on the message that accompanies the miracle. The content of the message is determinative. And this sort of skepticism about miracles, that miracles are not definitive proof. You have to look past the miracle to understand the purpose of the miracle, the agenda behind it, and what message it's intending to convey. That this skepticism, I will show, I hope in short order, leads to the rabbis' skepticism about miracles. And of course, they were in a competitive landscape. Christianity was growing around them, and they had to contend with claims about miracles that other religions were advancing to great success. So the rabbi skepticism, I think, can be rooted in this passage in Deuteronomy, which is itself expresses or conveys some ambiguity or skepticism about miracles. But generally, with this caveat that you really have to sort of examine the message and not simply focus on the impressiveness of the miracle. The biblical notion is that God's miracles and wonders sanctify God's name among the people. So there's sort of a sense of Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name, because they reinforce God's power and presence in the world. And the Bible suggests that message is authentic, and that should lead to our faith. So that's a backdrop, the biblical backdrop to what I want to continue to discuss, which is the rabbinic conception of miracles and their sense of how Hanukkah what the place of Hanukkah is in the trajectory of Jewish history, and whether miracles have persisted beyond the 5 books of Moses. Before we get to the rabbis, I think in order for us to appreciate further this backdrop, I wanted to include a couple of modern sources that express the very severe skepticism that many modern people, including perhaps many of us giving or listening to this lecture, feel about the existence of miracles. Miracles don't seem to comport with our sense of reality. There seems to be a natural order about the world. Miracles, I think most of us would agree, don't seem, dramatic miracles, conspicuous miracles of God's presence don't seem to occur on any regular basis in our existence. A lot of this is traceable to Spinoza, the 17th century Jewish philosopher who was excommunicated by his community in Amsterdam for many different reasons, but they could have cited this as an example of his heresy. Spinoza wrote, "The Israelites from all their miracles were unable to form a sound conception of God, as their experience testified. But when they had persuaded themselves that Moses had departed from among them, they petitioned Aaron to give them visible gods. And the idea of God they had formed as a result of their miracles was a calf." So as we all know, even in the aftermath of all the wondrous miracles in Exodus that accompanied the Exodus, in the book of Exodus that accompanied the Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites quickly succumbed to sin and backsliding and created a golden calf. So first, Spinoza is arguing, among other things, that miracles don't necessarily lead to any sound understanding of God or of the world or of nature, because even in the Torah, the Israelites didn't learn the right message. Having witnessed the great miracles of the Exodus from Egypt, they soon found themselves engaged in idolatry. The next text from David Hume, an 18th century Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, who generally was an empiricist. He focused on what we can understand about the world through concrete evidence. Hume defined miracles in a strong sense. Basically, whatever is naturally impossible. He strongly believed that there is a natural order in the world that is governed by scientific rules and principles, and that a miracle, a supposed miracle, is only that which violates those natural laws. One can question whether that's a good definition. If one, for example, if one posed to Hume the idea that humankind would be able to land on the moon, he might have defined that as a miracle that was unbelievable, incredible. That means not subject to being believed because it didn't comport with his empirical reality. But putting that to the side, Hume believed that miracles were proof of nothing. Not only are they contrary to the natural order, and there's much greater evidence on the side of the natural order, of the absence of miracles, than there is on the side of miracles. But the reality, as time has developed, is that many different religions claim competing sets of miracles in support of their own particular claims. He wrote, "In matters of religion, whatever is different is contrary. Every miracle pretended to have been wrought in any of these religions, and all of them abound in miracles, as its direct scope is to establish the particular system to which it is attributed. So it has the same force, though more indirectly, to overthrow every other system." And I won't read the rest, but he basically says, look, every religion claims miracles, so they essentially all cancel each other out. These dueling miracles, none of them is credible in any event. But when you see that each of them is competing with each other to establish credibility and authenticity on the basis of miracles that are peculiar to different religious systems, it just is further evidence that there's no rational basis to believe in miracles. So that's these two texts, many, I could have brought many more, and these are from centuries ago. So the sort of story or the argument militating against belief in miracles in the modern world only gets worse with time. That there are many more thinkers beyond Spinoza and Hume who don't believe in the possibility of miracles, no matter what the Bible seemed to have claimed. So that's the modern backdrop to our modern sensibility that that miracles in the Bible may just have been fabricated, may just have been an illusion, and more charitably, at best, maybe they should be understood non-literally, allegorically. But miracles to many modern skeptics cannot be the basis of religious faith and belief. So with that modern backdrop, I want to get us back to Jewish thought. And the next text, text 9, is from the Passover Haggadah. This is a well-known excerpt from the Haggadah, and perhaps its most important claim. In each and every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he left Egypt, as it is stated, and then it quotes a verse from Exodus. So in the Hebrew, B'chol dor v'dor, chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. So we're supposed to, the Haggadah tells us, put ourselves in the place of the biblical generation that left Egypt, the biblical generation that witnessed, experienced, absorbed, and accepted the reality of miracles. And the question that we modern Jews can certainly ask is, how are we expected to fulfill that mandate? How are we expected to successfully put ourselves in the shoes of those who left Egypt, who were privy to God's tangible presence, to God's very concrete miracle making, both in the Exodus from Egypt and in the desert? How do we do that when we haven't ourselves seen a miracle on any national scale in more than 2,000 years? That's the challenge of how to fulfill this Haggadah mandate. And even if one believes in the modern world in the possibility of miracles, how do we even know one when we see or hear about it? The existence of miracles, arguably, even if one believes that there's the possibility of the continuing possibility of miracles, how do we recognize one in the modern world in light of the skepticism that has developed? So our challenge as modern Jews is how does our historical memory, our historical attachment to past miracles, the miracles of the Bible, to, let's say, the miracles of Hanukkah, how does the rituals that we engage in to facilitate our memory, our affiliation, our attachment with such miracles, how does that successfully replace the immediacy, the vividness of the direct historical experience of miracles that our forebears in the desert experience? This, again, at minimum, these national miracles haven't occurred in a long time. So that the mandate to align ourselves with the perspective of the biblical generation is very challenging. Now, in light of this problem that the biblical generation saw and heard God and then believed, as we saw the prior text from Exodus, that they saw the splitting of the sea and God saving them, and that was the basis of their belief. And to them, God's presence was palpable and self-evident. What about us? What do we modern Jews? How do we modern Jews relate to the apparent absence of such miracles and to the much more obscure presence of God in our world? it's not only modern Jews that felt this, the rabbis themselves felt that. And I brought a few texts that show that even in rabbinic thought. So these rabbinic texts that I've included are from several centuries after the events of Hanukkah. So the first several centuries of the Common Era, but from 300 to 700 years after the events of Hanukkah. By that time, the rabbis themselves, I think these texts convey, they realized that something had changed in Jewish history. That yes, they believed wholeheartedly in the miracles of the Bible. They gave full faith and credit to the reality of those miracles. But I think the rabbis felt, as we do, as we modern Jews do, that similar miracles were not happening in their time. That something had changed in Jewish history. And we'll see in a moment that for them, Chanukah may have been that turning point, that pivot in Jewish history with respect to the existence, the reality of national miracles performed by God. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. The sages taught after the last of the prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi died, the divine spirit of prophetic revelation departed from the Jewish people. So this is the idea that prophecy essentially went away, that those were the last of the prophets in our Tanakh, in our biblical canon. And after them, the channel of prophecy, our direct connection with God. And I'll suggest that there is an alignment between prophecy, the open channel of prophecy, and the accessibility of miracles. That alignment of prophecy and miracles, there was a deterioration. There was or perhaps a total disappearance of both prophecy and miracle making. But the text goes on to say, but nevertheless, they, meaning in the post-prophet period, including in the rabbinic period, but nevertheless, they were still utilizing a divine voice, which they heard as a kind of echo of prophecy. And all of that is captured in the expression of bat kol, the daughter of a voice. So it's sort of an offshoot, a descendant, a second tier channel of a connection to God, the bat kol. Prophecy was no longer available. The rabbis had rabbinic texts indicate that they thought they had some access to an echo of the divine voice. And I didn't include it. I've included it in some prior lectures and courses. The very famous story of the oven of Achnai with Rabbi Eliezer, who brings all sorts of miracles on behalf of his legal position. But the majority of rabbis in the story reject his miracle making as the basis of Jewish legal determinations. And that story, among other things, teaches us that miracles are never the basis of halakha. They're never the basis, the definitive basis of Jewish legal conclusions. The miracles are not dispositive of Jewish law. So despite the fact that Rabbi Eliezer could invoke divine power and all sorts of miracles of the roof of the Beit Midrash collapsing and then stopping, of changing the course of water and wind, he didn't win the argument through those miracles, that they were not definitive. And so even the bat kol, this echo of prophecy, is not dispositive. But this is part of a larger notion that the rabbis express, that they lived in a time that was different from the Bible, that their generation was no longer entitled or had no longer had access to the kind of prophecy and direct line of communication that was expressed by both miracles and revelation that the biblical period, that generation of Jews had access to. I'm going to just mention a concept that I've mentioned before, but we don't have time to explore it in depth today, of hitkatnut or yeridat hadorot, the deterioration or the decline of the generations. It's a complicated subject, and there's not complete consensus about it, but most rabbinic texts suggest that there was some deterioration from the Torah, the time of the Bible, to their own period in the early centuries of the Common Era, that something had changed and had gotten worse. And that change is reflected in the fact that there used to be miracles, but there no longer national miracles in their own time. Rav Papa said to Abaya, so these are two Amoraim, rabbis of the Talmud, what is different about the earlier generations for whom miracles occurred? And what is different about us for whom miracles do not occur? So this is an express acknowledgement that miracles on a large, grand national scale were no longer occurring for them. And there's sort of an agitation, a pushback here, because they felt that perhaps they were deserving of miracles, but they weren't getting them. If it is because of Torah study in the years of Rabbi Yehuda, and that's just a prior rabbinic period, all of their learning was confined to the order of Nezikin, so that's one of the 6 orders, while we learn all 6 orders. So they're saying we really deserve miracles, and we're not getting them anymore. Abaya said to Rav Papa, the previous generations were wholly dedicated to the sanctification of God's name, while we are not as dedicated to the sanctification of God's name. So they're expressing their own anxiety about their status, and this is saying, we explain the fact that we're not getting miracles because we don't deserve them. And I think it goes back to the essence of miracles in the Bible, that miracles are messages meant to convey that God's name is sacred. God's power has to be paramount in our thinking. And so the rabbis are saying, well, if we ourselves, if we humans are not as dedicated to that concept of sanctification of God's name, then we're not deserving of miracles, which themselves are designed to glorify, to enhance, to sanctify God's name. So this is just one of many examples in rabbinic texts of an acknowledgement that their reality was different from the Bible, and they attribute it to their own failings, to their own deficiencies. Now, this is perhaps the most on-point text that we'll talk about, because this text suggested to me my title. I think it's a fair inference from this rabbinic text that the rabbis themselves believed that God had retired from the business of miracle making upon the conclusion of the events of Hanukkah. I didn't make up this notion. I think the rabbis actually had it almost 2,000 years ago. Rav Asi said, why was Esther, so Esther in the story of Purim, likened to the dawn? It is to tell you, just as the dawn is the conclusion of the entire night, so too Esther, meaning the events of Purim, was the conclusion of all miracles performed for the entire Jewish people. Again, we're referencing miracles performed on a grand scale. I'll get back to this, but the rabbis did believe, or they seemed to believe, that there were miracle makers, certain rabbis who had the capacity to perform miracles, but they were on a much smaller scale generally, and the miracle makers themselves were not objects of any devotion. And then the Gemara asks in response to this proposition that Purim was the end of national miracles. The Gemara asks, but isn't there the miracle of Hanukkah? And Hanukkah happened more than 200 years after the events, or about 200 years after the events of Purim. So what about Hanukkah? Hanukkah seemed to be a miracle on a national scale. The Gemara explains, it is true that additional miracles were performed after the miracle of Purim, meaning Hanukkah. However, it is with regard to miracles for which permission was granted to write them in the Bible. So Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, is part of our Tanakh, is part of our biblical canon. There is no book in the Bible that mentions Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not part of our biblical canon. So the answer given is, oh, that reference to Purim being the conclusion of national miracles was just referring to miracles that were incorporated into the Bible. Yes, Hanukkah happened, but that was accepted from the canon. It was not included. So to me, I think a reasonable inference of this text is that the rabbis themselves believed that Hanukkah, because it happened chronologically after the events of Purim, that Hanukkah was the last national miracle in Jewish history. Now, I just want to comment briefly on the fact of, because Purim and Hanukkah, as we saw early on in these texts, Maimonides packaged the laws of Purim and Hanukkah together. They're often discussed in conjunction with each other because they seem to have similar historical circumstances and even similar miracles, and they seem to represent in tandem the conclusion of national miracles in Jewish history. But this analogy that's made between Esther and the dawn is a strange analogy. It's a strange metaphor because the dawn is the breaking of light out of darkness. And one could assume, and I at first thought, well, the dawn is a positive thing, and the disappearance of miracles is a negative thing. So Esther being analogized to the dawn, it's strange that that is used as proof for the conclusion of miracles on a national scale, which one could think is a negative development in Jewish history. And it led me to think perhaps the rabbis thought that the disappearance, the absence of miracles in Jewish history is actually a positive development. That, and this has become a traditional theme, that our relationship with God is no longer based on miracles because we are theologically mature. That in our infancy, we needed miracles to prop up our belief, as in the book of Exodus. But by the time of the Rabbinic period, in the early centuries of the Common Era, miracles didn't occur because they were no longer needed, that there was some theological maturity, despite the deterioration of the generations that had occurred. But the main point of this text, for purposes of this talk, is that the rabbis themselves seem to acknowledge that Hanukkah was the last time that God performed miracles for the entire Jewish people. Now, this next passage from the Talmud, again, Purim is a useful companion to Hanukkah to talk about these issues about miracles. In the tractate of Chulin, the rabbis wrote, "From where in the Torah can one find an allusion to the events involving Esther?" They want some sort of Torah basis for the events of Purim, and they find it in a verse in Deuteronomy. And if you go down, it says, "And I will hide, haster astir," that God will hide God's face. And there's a play on words. You see it almost looks like Esther. So it seems to suggest the name of Esther in the book of Deuteronomy. So it's sort of a foreshadowing of the events of Purim, that one can claim the Torah actually has a hint of Purim in its verses that were revealed centuries before the events of Purim took place. And by the way, last year when I gave the Hanukkah lecture about the importance, the essence of light in the holiday of Hanukkah, we saw that there is also a traditional theme in some Jewish texts that there's a hint of Hanukkah in the Torah. In Parshat B'Halotcha, that Aaron was sort of a precursor. Aaron and his priestly family lighting the candles of the tabernacle were a precursor to the Maccabees of the Hanukkah story. But I want to highlight the fact that, to me, it's ironic, and it goes to the essence of miracles, that the rabbis are finding a Torah basis for the story of Purim. And just as a reminder, Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther that we read on Purim, has not a single reference to God in it. So God it's bereft of mention of God. God's not mentioned at all. One could understand the story of Purim very humanistically, that it was a matter of Jews standing up for themselves. There was no involvement or presence of God. The rabbis found the presence of God in it, and as we know, they thought it was a miraculous salvation in the story of Purim, just as they did. That was their interpretation of the story of the events of Hanukkah as well. But what I find ironic is that the verse that they use is the basis for the view that sometimes God is absent. God withdraws himself from history. So arguably it's ironic that the verse that they use to show that God was somehow present in the story of Purim is actually the verse that has been used in association, for example, with the Holocaust, that God's face was withdrawn from history. That the sort of hint that they provide is to me at best ambiguous or problematic. But the larger issue is that both Purim and Chanukah seem to represent this watershed in Jewish history. Miracles occurred on a national scale up until that time and no longer do. Finally, this, in terms of Purim, I won't read the whole thing, but this text from the Talmud, which is about God placing the mountain above the people as he wanted to reveal the Torah to them. Often the conclusion of the story is not taught or not remembered. This Midrash is that Tachti Tahar, that the people stood at the lower part of the mountain, implied that God was actually holding Mount Sinai above the people, and in effect, they were coerced into accepting the revelation of the Torah. And so it says, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, from here there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. The Jewish people can claim they were coerced into accepting it, and therefore it's not binding. Rava said, so in response to that legitimate argument that perhaps it was a coercive acceptance and therefore not valid or binding for future generations, Rava said, even so, they again accepted it willingly in the time of Achashverosh, so during the time of the Purim events, as it is written in Megillat Esther, that the Jews reaffirmed and took upon themselves what they had already taken upon themselves, meaning they reaffirmed what they had accepted through coercion at Sinai. They reaffirmed it centuries later during the time of Purim. And I think a reasonable inference is that miracles can be thought of as coercive, that what were the Jews to do in the face of seeing the sea split and seeing the manna provided for 40 years? In the face of all those miracles, how could the Israelites say anything but Na'aseh v'nishma, that we will do and we will then understand? That there was a sense of coerciveness about the dramatic and highly conspicuous and tangible miracles. The miracles took the form of food, for example, sustenance for 40 years in the desert. How could the Jews do anything but accept God's revelation? But later, when miracles were less conspicuous, and again, in Megillat Esther, God is not even mentioned. The suggestion is that they reaffirmed revelation, and perhaps that reaffirmation was in the willing reaffirmation in the absence of very conspicuous self-evident miracles. Perhaps that was even better. That was a more mature and even more impressive reaffirmation of their commitment to God. So the idea that miracles can be coercive and can tip the scales unfairly is a theme that I think one can coax out of these rabbinic texts, and that the absence of miracles can be thought of as not just a challenge to our faith, but an opportunity, that we have an opportunity to affirm our faith in God in the absence of conspicuous miracles. And that is certainly, I think, the case for us modern Jews, and has been the case for almost 2,000 years, according to the traditional Jewish understanding of when miracles occurred and when they stopped occurring on a national scale. This next rabbinic passage is from Pirkei Avot. And this suggests that the rabbis were trying to mitigate the reality of conspicuous miracles, that perhaps they weren't fully at ease with them because they didn't seem to be occurring certainly on any regular basis in their own time. And so they thought there was a natural order. Yes, miracles occurred, but those miracles were built into the fabric of creation by God. They were not sort of matters of happenstance and spontaneity on the part of God, but they were built into creation from the very beginning. They write 10 things were created on the eve of the first Sabbath, meaning of creation at twilight. And these are they: the mouth of the earth that swallowed Korach, the mouth of the well, the mouth of the donkey, and so on. These are miracles that reflect God's intervention in nature, but they're really part of the natural order. The miracles of the Torah are not necessarily, don't reflect the fact that God all of a sudden decided to intervene in history, but these had been preordained by God within the fabric of creation. Their sense of miracles by the rabbis also is that to the extent miracles continue to occur on any scale, they were much more modest in nature than in prior periods. This next text is from Maimonides, and this builds on the text that we just read. Maimonides was a big believer in the natural order, that there is nature and miracles may have occurred, but he tried as best as he could to avoid embracing the idea that there were all sorts of sporadic interventions by God in the natural order. He wrote, "This occasioned the sages to say that all miracles which deviate from the natural course of events, whether they have already occurred or according to promise are to take place in the future, were foreordained by the divine will during the 6 days of creation, nature being then so constituted that those miracles which were to happen really did afterwards take place." So the miracles were not an innovation, as he writes. They were built into the very fabric of creation by God. So they were divinely ordained, but they didn't reflect God changing God's mind or God suddenly deciding to intervene. These were planned well ahead of time. So really the sort of the rule of nature encompasses the exceptions being the miracles, but the exceptions are built into the stable, consistent, predictable natural order. By the way, I'll note that in Maimonides' 13 principles, he does not mention a necessary dogma of belief in miracles. The idea of miracles is absent from the 13 principles. That's not necessarily dispositive of the fact that Maimonides thought that a good Jew, shouldn't believe in miracles. But he chose, for whatever reasons, he chose not to include miracles explicitly in his 13 principles. So getting back to the rabbis, they had the idea that national miracles had concluded with Hanukkah, but they still believed in the possibility of miracles. They just had to change their conception of what could be miraculous. This next text from the Talmud says, Rabbi Alexandri said that Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, "Greater is the miracle performed for the sick person," meaning the sick person in, let's say, in rabbinic times, just a regular old sick person, than the miracle that was performed for Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who were rescued in the book of Daniel from this fiery furnace. As in that miracle in the Tanakh, they were rescued from the fire of a layman, and anyone is capable of extinguishing it. But that fire afflicting a sick person, meaning any old sick person with a fever, is the fire of heaven. And who can extinguish that? Meaning only God can extinguish that sickness miraculously. So the rabbis start to transform the sense of miracles. Miracles were not happening on any regular basis, and perhaps not at all, in the centuries since the events of Hanukkah. But they still believed in the potential of miracles to occur basically within plain sight in the course of ordinary events. And here, God's curing a sick person represents a miracle to them. So that the miracles that occur in everyday life are sort of more modest in scale, are more personal, are more intimate, and certainly not on the national scale of miracles that occurred in the Bible and through the events of Hanukkah. And I think this next passage captures that very well. This is a rabbinic book of Midrash on the Psalms. You, meaning God, you perform many miracles and wonders for us every day, and no man knows. And then the rabbi quotes a passage that proves that. This says that providing sustenance, the piece of bread, livelihood, is equal in importance to the sea, which was divided asunder. So the rabbis are saying God's provision of sustenance to us on a daily basis is equal in magnitude to the miracle of the splitting of the Reed Sea. Just as the world cannot do without the piece of bread, so it is not possible for the world to do without miracles and wonders. And then this is again, I think a striking outline of the rabbinic conception of miracles and the transformation of the conception of miracles. How are we to envisage this? A man is lying on a bed and a serpent is on the ground before him. When he seeks to rise, the serpent becomes aware of him. When he's about to put his feet on it, the serpent flees from him. And the man does not know what wonders the Holy One, blessed be he, performs for him. Now, I'm quoting Rabbi Bolton here, who is fond of the saying, is it odd or is it God? And I think that sense of the miraculous nature of some coincidences is really embedded in our everyday life. The rabbis are pretty much saying that right here, that when one avoids danger that was imminent, that perhaps a miracle was performed by God on that person's behalf that we either take for granted or that we don't even recognize. So miracles on the grand scale of the Bible and of Purim and Hanukkah have been transformed into miracles of the everyday. Getting back to the specifics of Hanukkah and what miracles occurred, this is a very famous passage from Tractate Shabbat in the Babylonian Talmud. The Gemara asks, what is the basis of Hanukkah? Why do we light lights? Why do we kindle the Chanukah on Hanukkah? And the context here is important. First of all, there's no tractate of Hanukkah in the Talmud. There's no separate tractate devoted to the laws of Hanukkah. This discussion comes in the context of Shabbat candles, and only after a long discussion of Shabbat candles is there a subsequent discussion of the candles of Hanukkah. And then sort of out of the blue, in very sudden, surprising fashion, the rabbis, almost like an afterthought, like, yeah, by the way, why do we even celebrate this holiday that we've now discussed candles related to? What is this holiday all about? The Gemara answers, the sages taught on the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. So the fact that there are 8 days, even having in mind that Rav Yosef Karo later questioned why the holiday is 8 days and not 7, if the miracle itself the duration of that miracle was only 7 days. one may not eulogize on those days and one may not fast them. What is the reason? So why do we have this celebration? When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary by touching them. And when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious over them, so that's a very quick, almost in passing reference to the military victories that the Hashmonaim, and that military victory we'll see in a moment, is featured elsewhere. But almost in passing, the rabbis refer to the military victory. So after the military victory, the Hashmonaim searched and found only one cruse of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest. And there was sufficient oil there to light the candelabrum for only one day. A miracle occurred, and they lit the candelabrum from it 8 days. The next year, they instituted the holidays with recitation of Hallel and special Thanksgiving prayers. This is the first mention of the miracle of oil. There are prior texts from the books of Maccabees and other sources, Josephus, the history of Josephus. The miracle of the oil is not mentioned in any prior text at any prior time until this text in the Babylonian Talmud, which is dated to about 600 years or so after the events of Hanukkah. So the miracle of the oil becomes important, and I would argue that it's probably the miracle that we think of most readily now when we think of the essence of Hanukkah. It first emerged centuries after the actual events of Hanukkah, and it's found in no other texts. The military victory that is featured in other texts is mentioned here only in passing. So this rebranding of Hanukkah by the rabbis, that they demilitarize the sort of primary miracle, they spiritualize it, make it the miracle of the oil, and they feel some need to explain why we do all of this candle lighting in the first place. And I think it is, it can be argued that this rebranding, this recasting of the Hanukkah miracle from a military victory, or even some, in its roots, some celebration that mirrored the holiday of Sukkot and lasted for 8 days and involved the altar, a fire on the altar in some way, then it seemed to move through a development of focusing on the military victory by the Hasmoneans over the Greek Syrians. In the Talmudic phase, it continued, the miracle, the primary miracle continued its journey and started to feature the oil. And it's this holiday, this miracle of the oil lasting 8 days that really had legs. This was the miracle that was transferable, that was portable, that was replicable through our lighting the Chanukah. That despite the circumstances that the rabbis and Jews found themselves for 2,000 years until the creation of the modern state of Israel, with the absence of sovereignty over our fate and our land, we could light the candles. And I spoke about this in part last year, that the candle lighting, the miracle of the oil, had historical resonance and the eternal divine presence in our lives, despite the absence of conspicuous miracles over the last 2,000 years or more than 2,000 years. These lights can remind us of God's presence in Jewish history and Jewish lives wherever we find ourselves. And focusing further on Hanukkah, the liturgy, this is the second portion of the Al-Hanisim prayer. This is a sort of another narrative. So we just looked at the Talmudic text that rebranded the Hanukkah miracle as focused on the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days instead of 1. This, the primary passage of Al-Hanisim focuses on, in part, on the military victory, but quickly moves into sort of spiritualizing it. You in great mercy stood by your people in time of trouble. You defended them, vindicated them, avenged their wrongs, delivered, and listen to this language. There are 2 clauses about the military victory, and then it quickly migrates to more spiritual terms. Delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak and the many into the hands of the few. That seems to be a reference to the miraculous military victory, but it becomes spiritualized. And the corrupt into the hands of the pure of heart, and the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and arrogant into the hands of those occupied in your Torah. Near the bottom it says, then your children came into your shrine, cleansed your temple, purified your sanctuary, and kindled lights in your sacred courts. And they set aside these 8 days of dedication in order to give thanks and praise to your great name. Note that the miracle of the oil is not even mentioned here. So this is the primary liturgical passage that we say several times every day during Hanukkah. And we say it's said much more often than the blessings that accompany the lighting of the candles. So the outline of the military victory really has a more prominent place in the liturgy, even though it is spiritualized, even as it's referenced in the liturgical passage. And here, I brought these out of order just to make a point. This is the beginning of the Al Hanisim passage that we say every day during Hanukkah. We thank you for the miracles and for the deliverance. So they're recognized miracles occurred during Hanukkah on a grand national scale. We thank you for the miracles and for the deliverance and for the heroic acts and for the salvations and for the wars that you performed for our ancestors in those days, in this season. Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. Now, you see, I placed that one word in brackets. Most Sidurim, when I grew up, the Sidur that I used in my Orthodox school and shul said, Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh, in those days at this season. So referring exclusively to miracles that occurred in the past to our ancestors. But there is also a very long-standing textual tradition that dates back to Amram Gaon, so to the 9th century, of a variant that says, Bayamim hahem uvazman hazeh, in those days and in this time, meaning in this historical period. So and by the way, that uvazman hazeh is what appears in our Sidur Sim Shalom that we use at Or Zarua. That is more theologically assertive about the continuing existence of miracles. That miracles, we don't just focus on miracles that happen in the days of yore, 2,000 years ago, but we should focus our attention and be sensitive to the possibility and existence, the reality of miracles in our own times as well. So it's more theologically assertive, but it's actually a very traditionally based variant. It's not a modern innovation. It's based on a very old textual option. But these two choices, saying Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh, or in contrast, Bayamim hahem uvazman hazeh, there's a difference of one letter, the Vav, really represent different theological perspectives. Whether our focus should be completely on ancient miracles that occurred to our ancestors. And again, I would argue that creates the problem of how do we fulfill the mandate during Passover of trying to conceive of ourselves, imagine ourselves as having gone out of Egypt when those miracles don't occur for us anymore. The alternative, adding the Vav, suggests that there are miracles, perhaps on a different scale or of a different nature, that occur even in our own times. The idea that Hanukkah reflects different narratives. So I referred to the fact that the earliest texts about Hanukkah seem to suggest that it was an 8-day celebration patterned on Sukkot, and maybe as a replacement for Sukkot, because the Jews couldn't celebrate Sukkot in its time because of the Greeks profaning the temple. So when the Hasmoneans regained the temple, it was really a substitute celebration of Sukkot. So originally it was an 8-day celebration. There's no mention of the miracle of the oil. There's really no mention of the military victory. And then it goes to a phase where the military victory is the more prominent theme of the miracle. And then we get to the, as I showed before, the Talmudic text 600 years after the events of Hanukkah, in which emerges suddenly the idea of a miracle involving the 8 days of oil. These different stories have gone through developments and evolutions and there's a different focus to each of these stories. And this is the text in text 22 of Mi Yamalel, a very traditional song. Mi Yamalel Gvurot Israel. It's a beautiful melody, and in my family we sing it as a round. We have two groups of people singing, and it sounds very pretty. It sounds, if you don't pay attention to the words, it sounds like it's very traditional. It's actually, been incorporated into the standard set of songs that Jewish students sing and Jewish families sing. It's actually a pretty radical song. It was written by a secular Zionist in 1936, Menashe Rabina, and the words, when you focus on them, are quite subversive. Who can recall the heroic acts of Israel? Who can count them? For in every generation, the hero will arise, the redeemer of the nation. Note, this is a play on a verse from the Psalms, Mi Yamalel Gvurot. In the Psalms, it's about who can recount or recall the heroic acts of God. Here, it's the heroic acts of Israel. And the Redeemer, in this version of the miraculous story, it's not God, but it's a human being who will arise to redeem the nation. And then the next passage, Shema. What could be more traditional than the word Shema as resonating with traditional liturgy? But not here. That's not what follows. It's not listen to God. Listen, in those days at this season, the Maccabee redeemed and brought salvation. And in our days, all the nation of Israel must unite, rise up, and be redeemed. So this is a humanistic version of the miracle of Hanukkah, that the Maccabees redeemed the nation in those days. So in our days, in the years leading up to the establishment of the state of Israel, we human beings, we people, we Zionists need to rise up, band together, and redeem ourselves. There's no mention of God in this song. There's no mention of oil. And to the extent that there's any miracle at all, there's any redemption of the people, it occurs through human agency at the hands of human beings who show boldness and initiative about taking control of their own history. That leads to the next text. For those of you who are shul goers at Or Zarua, you'll know that we say this every Shabbat. Avinu Shabbat Shamayim Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo Barechet Medinat Yisrael Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. So we say this every week in our liturgy. Our Father who is in heaven, Rock and Redeemer of Israel, blessed state of Israel, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. That's not accidental language at the end. That the redemption there is capitalized because it refers, at least it can refer to the messianic redemption, to the redemption of our people that will be driven and controlled and initiated by God. So the suggestion here, on its plain terms, the suggestion of this prayer that we say every week at Or Zarua and at many synagogues around the world, is that the modern state of Israel is the beginning of that redemptive process that will be miraculous in nature. That gets us back to our topic, that perhaps the modern state of Israel is the beginning, an element of the first national scale miracle in Jewish history in more than 2,000 years. So since national miracles concluded with the events of Hanukkah, perhaps no national scale miracles have occurred. But if we interpret the modern state of Israel as the beginning of this God-driven process of redemption, then perhaps the modern state of Israel and modern day events occurring today can be understood theologically and miraculously. Now here too, just like I did above where I brought the variant of Uva Zman Hazeh, some Sidurim, I think it was at the at the sort of contribution of a prior chief rabbi of England, added the words shetehei, that the modern state of Israel should become, we're praying that it may become the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. The inclusion of that word is important theologically because it suggests that our belief about the significance of the state of Israel represents our hope that it will be the beginning of a process of redemption of both Jewish history and global history, but that we haven't reached that stage yet, that it's a matter of hoping that we get there and not an affirmation of any fact about the change in the nature of history. Again, we don't include in our liturgy doors the word shetehei. And of course, one can interpret the end of that clause, the flowering of our redemption, differently. But many traditional Jews interpret it to mean that the modern state of Israel is part of a miraculous divine process of redemption. I'm going to conclude, I hope in just a few minutes, with what I think is sort of the rabbinic and now our modern conception of miracles. So again, there's a rabbinic text that I've included here that suggests that Hanukkah was the last of the national scale miracles in Jewish history. And to the extent that we want to believe in the possibility of miracles, we have to find them in our everyday lives, within the natural order. This is the Modim prayer, that the Thanksgiving prayer that we say every day of the week. It's part of the Amidah. We are thankful to you that you, Lord, are our God and the God of our ancestors forever, rock of our lives. We will give thanks to you and recount your praise for our lives that are committed into your hand, and for our souls which are entrusted to you, and for your miracles that every day are with us. In the Hebrew, Ve'al nisecha shebachol yom imanu, and for your wonders and benefactions at all times, evening, morning, and afternoon. And we thank God for those daily miracles. Now, this general paragraph of thanksgiving for the daily miracles that occur within our lives really is sort of the capstone of many liturgical portions in the earlier parts of the service, where when we get up in the morning, we say Modeh Ani, that we thank God for giving us back our soul. We then say the Birkot HaShachar, the blessings of the morning, that God has facilitated our sort of getting to the next day successfully. And we thank him every day for the sort of miracle of existing and for our status being as it is. So this is the capstone paragraph of a liturgical theme that runs throughout our daily prayers. We're thanking God for the miraculous nature of everyday existence. This next prayer is one that is much less known. I was introduced to this prayer in, I think it was 3rd or 4th grade in my Jewish day school, by the parent of one of my classmates, a doctor who came in and told us that to him, this was the most significant prayer. And this prayer of thanking God is really about the miraculous nature, the majesty of our digestive system. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who formed man with wisdom and created within him openings and hollow organs. It is obvious and known in the presence of your glorious throne that if one of them were ruptured, or if one of them were blocked, it would be impossible to exist and stand in your presence, even for a short while. Blessed are you, Lord, who heals all flesh and performs wonders. So this prayer, which you say upon using the restroom, is really a prototypical example of being grateful to God for the basic functioning of our daily existence. The next text by Rabbi Heschel, I'm not going to read it, but this is the text through which he expresses radical amazement that he thinks we need to develop, to cultivate our sense of wonder at the world, that within nature, within the everyday world that God has created for us, we can appreciate the divine presence. So even though we no longer witness, we no longer sense grand miracles on the scale of the Bible or of the events of Hanukkah, nevertheless, we can still appreciate God's presence among us. I'm going to end with something that is familiar to, I believe, all of us. This is the Shahianu Prayer. This is the prayer that, that, among other things, we say on the first night of Hanukkah. It's the first blessing that we say upon the candle lighting. We don't say it for the rest of the holiday. But as you know, the Shahianu Prayer is said on many occasions of something being new, of something being fresh, of something being occurring for the first time in a long time. For example, Rabbi Bolton has encouraged us to say Shahianu in shul when we see people whom we haven't seen for a long time during the pandemic. But I want to conclude by focusing on the words, "Blessed are you, Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and brought us to this season." To me, the Shahianu Prayer is really a perfect way to understand Hanukkah. That Hanukkah, yes, it is a pivot point, a juncture, a critical juncture in Jewish history, because national scale miracles don't seem to occur after Hanukkah and for the next 2,000 years, arguably until perhaps the modern state of Israel. But nevertheless, we can cultivate a sensibility of God's presence in our lives and of the possibility of miracles within our daily existence. And to me, I would argue that the greatest miracle of Jewish history, and one that to me stands out precisely in the absence of grand national scale miracles for the people as a whole, is that we as a people have actually lasted and now are flourishing to this day. That God has, like the Shahianu Prayer tells us, that God has kept us alive, not just individually, but as a people, despite our history. And that what is miraculous and amazing and extraordinary on a Jewish national level, again, despite the absence of conspicuous miracles, is that every year, without fail, Rosh Hashanah follows Tisha B'Av. It is amazing to me that every Tisha B'Av, when it used to be Rabbi Wexler, now it's Rabbi Bolton for many years, lists the litany of terrible things that have happened in Jewish history. And none was as terrible as the Holocaust that has happened essentially in our modern period, right before our lifetimes, and in the lifetimes of some of our parents. Despite all that, despite the Tisha B'Av that recounts all of these tragedies, the Jewish people still exists, and that every Rosh Hashanah, we can appreciate and embrace the miracle that we as a people are still here, and that we still exist despite the historical circumstances that have been a burden to us for centuries. And I'll conclude by saying that I'm going to respectfully disagree with the prophet Zechariah. We read Zechariah's passage yesterday in shul. I'm sorry, every year we read it on Shabbat Hanukkah, that says, "Not by might and not by power, but by my spirit." My suggestion is that Hanukkah teaches us that it's really the confluence of might and spirituality that will help perpetuate the Jewish people. And we can thank God for our national survival despite the absence of conspicuous miracles. We can believe that it's miraculous that we're all still around. Thank you.
Thank you. No, can I say something?
Sure, Jack.
Thank you. You know, as Schechter parents, our kids periodically gave presentations, the entire class would. And at the end of each kid's presentation, we were expected to ask questions, but it was expected before we asked a question that we would say something complimentary first. And I sometimes didn't ask a question because I couldn't think of something complimentary to say about one of the presentations. And that's on me, not on the kid. With you, it's always easy. I never have to struggle to find a way to say something nice. And talking about miracles, pretty miraculous that you can completely engage an entire audience of people for 60 or 90 minutes of straight talking, but be so eloquent and interesting and engaging that we're all very happy listen. So thank you again for another one of your amazing classes. Based on the title of,
thank you, Jay.
You're welcome, Yashkoch. Based on the title, I didn't know whether you were going in the direction of believing that God had retired from miracles. But going right from Chanukah to a modern example in a part, and I agree with all of your mentionings and modim and whatnot of the miracles people would consider small miracles that happen every day, but which are really amazing miracles in and of themselves. Even the Lubavitcher Rebbe believed that there were many miracles associated with the Six-Day War. So that brings us right back to very modern period and a military conflict. So I just wanted to point that one out because I think part of the reason we have trouble with miracles is not because we don't see them so often so much as we are bothered by the fact when it appears that God doesn't intervene when we would have wanted that. But I do believe in nisim that we see and that we experience. And I do think that I know at the time of the Six-Day War, because probably most of us on this call were either kids or teenagers or even slightly older at the time. And it is one of those things that's simply the word that comes to mind. There was no other way to see it. And some people simply saw it as miraculous, but weren't necessarily religious believers. But that's still the word you use. There's just no other way to assimilate what happened. That's all. So thank you again.
I appreciate your comment. Let me just quickly address your point, Jay. I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I think there, among certain groups, there is a danger in viewing events in the modern state of Israel theologically like that. And it leads to certain conclusions that people draw about how we should behave in the modern political world that are dangerous. It's also, to the extent that one attributes a miraculous nature to something like the Six-Day War, one can question whether that enhances or detracts from our sense of human agency. Would we achieve the same result if we viewed human successes like that in a miraculous way? I don't mean to answer the question, but I do think one could view it differently. One could view it as non-miraculous and as simply an amazing product of human effort and human agency, and that there is some peril in viewing it in theological terms.
You're right, and at the same time, there's a danger in doing the opposite. We sometimes, because of the passage of time, we become blind to the fact of the relevance of the human role. And I think to some extent, we could certainly say there are nisim that are God acting in a way that is beyond our capabilities or our realm. But then there are also times where we are expected to recognize our role. And we talk about sinat chinam and the destruction that we experience. It doesn't mean that had the Jewish people been unified, we wouldn't have been subject to military occupation at times. But certainly the internal dissension within our community that weakened us in the face of an onslaught. We now say, oh, God exiled us from our land. And sure, but there is a human role in what happens. And the Six-Day War, I think, is a great example because there is that military side. And sure, a lot of the people involved in that military, probably most of the people involved in it, if not almost all, we're not believers religiously. But I think we need to recognize that we still play a part. And the miraculous sometimes is something that augments what we're expected to be doing, as opposed to simply something out of the blue, so to speak. The splitting of the Red Sea was one of the things I noticed wasn't mentioned as one of the things that was created that goes back to actual creation. Now, granted, it wasn't a physical object, but I don't think that passage was meant to preclude that there were other things, or to explain that all miracles don't really count because they were part of the initial fabric of creation.
And you make the important and useful point that most miracles are actually constituted of both, in traditional Jewish thought, of both divine action and human agency. So just as probably the most prominent example, the crossing of the Red Sea clearly had to involve God's very active, palpable, intervention in history. But it also required some human being to jump into the water.
That's right.
And that's an example of the partnership, of the divine human partnership that leads to miracles. Last thing I'll say before I invite any other questions, I saw that Diane noted in the chat that the birth of every child can be thought of as miraculous. I agree. The birth of every child, just from beginning to end, in terms of how people are created, is I mentioned the digestive system. This is a more appealing example of how we really can conceive of everyday existence, things that happen every day, as nevertheless extraordinary. Even if we can explain the science, I'm not saying that they're inexplicable scientifically, but the science itself is amazing. And one can attribute divine participation in that as well.
Marc, question, comment?
Yes, Art.
First of all, thanks for this marvelous presentation. I can't imagine how many hours it took you to put that thing together, covering so many bases. To add,
I just started this morning.
Right. So to add just a bit of levity to an otherwise quite serious discussion, I have another darshan to bring to your attention, and that would be Oscar Hammerstein Jr., who in Flower Drum Song has the feminine lead, Mei Li, pronounce 100 million miracles are happening every day. I would also point out that a commentator, Michael Koplow, has come out with an interesting discussion on what Hanukkah means to the Jews in Israel and what Hanukkah means to the Jews in the United States. And he argues that they're two separate phenomena. Without the citation of the author, points out the fact that in Israel today, celebration of Hanukkah is significantly related to the establishment by the people of a Jewish state in the midst of all of the sea of problems that befell them. Whereas for Jews in America, it's in some respects a celebration of the freedom of our own religion in this country and our ability during this holiday season to have something really good to celebrate that derives from our history.
Yeah, Art, I agree wholeheartedly with that. And my inclusion of the MLL song was meant to, as sort of a proxy for the idea that in modern Zionism, they have embraced the Maccabees for their own good political and military reasons of sovereignty in our land, and that it has, the story of Hanukkah has a different resonance for different Jewish communities around the world. And the point I was trying to make during my talk was that Jewish tradition itself embodies these different narratives about what Hanukkah should mean to us. And those different narratives embrace and embellish or elaborate on different miracles. So different miracles can play key roles in different Hanukkah narratives.
Agreed.
I'm not sure I can see everyone's hand, but are there any other questions?
Benjamin, you have your hand up? No? Charlie? Well, first of all, I was glued on your talk today. This was a great talk. Oh, I'm terrible at that, at speaking in the microphone. One of the things you didn't talk about was wisdom and the development of wisdom. We thank God for wisdom in the Amidah. And I would make the argument, I would make the argument or propose the hypothesis that as God has backed away from us, as God's intervention in our lives has decreased over time, our ability to use our wisdom has increased. So the graph would look like that. And is the role of wisdom sort of downplayed? Is the gift of wisdom, should that be considered a miracle? And is that why God has been able to back off away from us? And I could give you a lot of modern day miracles in the area of drug development, Gleevec, the statins, the new classes of programmed death inhibitors for the immune system, so they're able to attack cancers, blah, 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 blah. And all this comes from our wisdom, which according to the Amidah, and I would assume other sources, is a gift from God. And is that why God has been able to back away from us and sort of allow us to go it on our own without his daily interventions?
Yeah, Charlie, I think it's a useful way of looking at it. I mean, there are all sorts of things that we're grateful to God for that I didn't mention, and the Amidah has all sorts of references to thanking God for this or that. I was focused on our prayers of thanksgiving as it relates to the notion of, as they relate to the notion of the miraculous nature of our lives or not. So we have a lot to be grateful for, but I think your main point is valid. And I think it does reflect sort of mainstream traditional rabbinic thought that with the giving of the Torah and through study of the Torah, we have access.
Yeah, that's the other thing, study.
Yeah, we have access to the wisdom of God in a way, again, that is sort of portable and transferable and democratic in nature and is accessible to people. We don't need prophecy. We don't need miracle making anymore because, you know, we've essentially moved beyond that stage, and that we have a more mature foundation of religiosity and a way to relate to God that doesn't hinge on witnessing conspicuous miracles, and our growth in wisdom and knowledge that is a gift from God through the Torah and otherwise is related to the diminished need for miracles to sustain our faith.
Bobby or Barry, I see that your hand up. I don't know which one of you has the question. And then we'll make that the last one before I give you a last softball.
Okay. All right, we got unmuted. So again, thank you so much for this really fantastic talk. I like the phrase that I learned in Israel in 1982, which said, in Israel, if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist. For many of us, the establishment of the state of Israel itself was a miracle. And we could go back into trying to maybe tighten our definition of a miracle, because I think that there are varying interpretations of that, but I think that's really part of the semantic problem here. I think that if we say something that a miracle is something that no one thought could be accomplished or achieved, I actually put the vaccines of last year was my Hanukkah miracle of last year, because I think if you polled 1,000 of the most learned biomedical scientists at the beginning and asked how long would it take for a vaccine to get out, I think you would not have had a single one of them predict how long it actually took. So I resonate a lot with what Charlie said, because I every day see these miracles. I'm among the population who took care of patients with HIV and watched them die one after another, with us being able to do nothing. And then all of a sudden, because of the wisdom God gave us, all of a sudden they weren't dying. And in fact, they were getting better. So it's really hard not to view those things as miraculous, at least by my common sense definition of what that notion is. So I think that this has really been a really terrific opportunity to think hard about these subjects, and really appreciate the chance to learn and to share thoughts.
Thank you, Barry. Just a quick response. First, I resisted or shied away from giving a definition of miracles. I suggested that David Hume had a strong sense of miracles, that it had to be a violation of nature. I resisted giving a definition because definitions have varied among different thinkers, and if you define miracle, the miraculous in a certain way, it excludes the possibility of seeing miracles in other ways. So that's why I shied away from providing any precise or certain definition. And then the second point, I don't disagree with you, but I would know that someone who's skeptical of religion or of the existence of God will not see those things as miraculous. That I think it really does depend on whether one has an inclination to view the world theologically, and if one doesn't have that perspective, that skeptic or atheist or agnostic person will not be led to view the vaccine as miraculous or scientific advances as miraculous in nature. That doesn't mean we shouldn't, but that, there is room for debate about what is perfectly explicable in terms of human initiative and what seems to require divine assistance.
Yeah, I just make one last comment. I've never viewed God's miracles as necessarily having to be uniquely Jewish. That I think that I'm not sure I really connect to. So at any rate, that aspect of it, I've never considered that a necessary consideration. I think it's great when the Jewish miracles can actually affect the entire world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I didn't mean to imply that miracles can't affect people beyond Jews. I did reference the fact that because religions have competing sets of miracles, it creates room for controversy about what establishes the credibility or authenticity of any particular religion. But I agree with you that God's miracles don't have to be confined to Jews or to the Jewish community.
All right, so let me bring you back right to the miracle of Hanukkah that we all pretty much focus on, as you mentioned, that miracle of the cruse of oil and the fire burning for 8 days, despite the questions in the Beit Yaakov with by Yosef Karo of 7 days or 8. The miracle of Hanukkah and the placement of it in the Babylonian Talmud 600, 700 years after the holiday festival is established is quite a moment of re-centering the Jewish people on a miracle for advancing a cause. And in this case, the cause was a home-based ritual, because the Gemara says, as we mentioned in Shul yesterday, Ish ner lebeito. It is a home-based ritual that they were trying to inspire. And I'm wondering if the miracle of survival that ultimately you referred to in bringing us through the sources, and even with all the controversy about miracles thinking, post-Holocaust, what did sustain the Jewish people? Not just the willingness to take up arms when we needed to, like with the Maccabees, especially in our time, miracle or not, States of Israel, miracle or not, Jabotinsky and the defense groups after the pogroms, but the miracles of not just spirit, like the prophet Zechariah talked about, but rituals. And without the rituals and giving more depth to the rituals, I don't believe that the miracle of Jewish survival would be as apparent to us today. And that the miracle is actually survival, as you suggest. And here's my take quickly on the oil story. The rabbis sometimes, and many strata of the Gemara, I've said this in other places in different lectures, create children's literature. They create inspirational, educational, children's literature, tales that someone might write into an illustrated children's book today. They included in the Gemara. I don't believe that they thought that there was really an 8-day kind of miracle. They actually knew Megillat Ta'anit in all its different forms. And Megillat Ta'anit says they found oil. Guess what? They found oil and they lit lights. But they rekindled the light of the altar and they rededicated the altar. And it's really, Hanukkah is really a rededication of the altar festival. It's not even about the oil in the cruse that had the Kohen Gadol's seal. That was all a great illustrated, beautiful children's tale that speaks to the child in each of us. But they know that it's ritual to which we have to be dedicated. And wouldn't it be interesting, final point, and I want your reaction, Marc, if the only thing we did now was think that Jewish spirituality and intellectual reflection on our history was the most important, as opposed to the miracle of getting together for the rituals that really sustain the Jewish people. Because in the end, that sustenance of ritual that the rabbis were interested in, not just study, right? Because the later rabbis said, if we study all 6 orders, don't we get miracles? No, the rabbis knew in Shabbat, in the Gemara, that it was candle lighting that would sustain us in the house and in the synagogue. So I wonder what your reaction is to that notion that the miracle is the continued rituals of the Jewish people and not just the intellectualization and putting Judaism in museums.
Rabbi, that was a softball because I think you know that I'm a big fan of Jewish ritual myself. And I totally agree with the power of the wisdom of the rabbi's strategy to place candlelighting at the center of Hanukkah's both ritual practice and theoretical significance. In my talk last year about the essence of candlelighting, that is at the heart of Hanukkah, the significance of light in Jewish thought, near the end of my talk, and I'm doing this by memory, but I had come across a striking text that written by a non-Jew that described this non-Jew's perspective on being in Rome, in Italy, and seeing the Arch of Titus, which has the carving of in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple and the carrying away by the Romans of the temple menorah. Walking past the Arch of Titus and walking to the Jewish, I don't know if it was essentially a ghetto, but it's still there, the Jewish neighborhood in the environs of the Arch of Titus, and seeing there Jewish homes with mezuzot on their doorposts that embody the revelation and our connection to God of Torah and our commitment to Jewish tradition and practice, and the actual lighting of Chanukah in Jewish windows. So the Arch of Titus may have memorialized the destruction of a Jewish community, but actual Jews were living nearby with their homes marked by mezuzot and Chanukiot that reflected actual Jewish continuity, 2,000 years after the Arch of Titus was erected. So I totally agree that the ritual of candlelighting, just like Shabbat candlelighting, has helped perpetuate that sense of continuity and survival, not just thinking about its significance, but actually doing it and having those markers of Jewish identity in our homes has been key to the miracle that is Jewish survival.
Amen, amen. Our candlelighting will be so much brighter this evening, Marc, because of your erudition, your fertile mind, and the way you stitch together sources is a blessing to the Jewish people. It makes good on our ritual blessing of La'asok b'divrei Torah, that we engage in words of Torah each day of our Jewish lives, along with that Yatzar et ha'adam b'chokhmah, that God created us with wisdom is not just about the digestive system, but thank God about the intellectual capacity that you demonstrate and that we aspire to in terms of Jewish studies, and that we all should recommit to learning Torah together for each holiday and every holiday. May our different celebrations be brighter that way. Marc, of course, is the chair of our programming committee. Anyone who would like to help support intellectual life at Or Zarua with a tzedakah donation in his honor so that we can bring further scholars to our community, I'm not being bashful to say I would love to make a Shabbaton in your honor, Marc. So I would like very much to make that happen for this year. As we return back to Or Zarua, I'm already starting with my discretionary fund, a pledge of $500 towards that endeavor. And so it's now recorded. Whoever else is listening after this lecture, please get in touch with me to help me make that fund a reality so we can organize a Shabbaton to thank you for your endeavors with creating these lectures, Marc. And I want to say that there is a powerful notion of making good on what we discussed today, the miracle that will light 8 lights and put them in the windows and spread out the miracles in New York City and everywhere we are. I see people from lots of different places around the I don't know, maybe the country, but at least the neighborhoods and New York. So do that. And then 7:15 tomorrow morning, that's when we have to make the minyan happen for the last day of Hanukkah in the sanctuary, and we can complement our celebrations in the home. So join us tomorrow for that, if you can. Noon at Zoom for Torah study tomorrow, and continue with a bright Hanukkah the rest of the day. Todah, Marc. Thank you again. Beautiful and wonderful lecture.
Have a wonderful rest of the of Hanukkah.
Thank you, Marc. Wonderful.
Great job.
Thank you.